This is absolutely devastating. More than 100 BBC employees have written a letter to the Director General, Tim Davie, complaining that the corporation has become a mouthpiece for Israel. It was also signed by 300 other journalists and media professionals. One of them was yours truly. The BBC employees, as you would expect, all anonymous, because otherwise they would face grave consequences in terms of their careers. Now, the letter says we're writing to express our concerns over opaque editorial decisions and censorship at the BBC on the reporting of Israel-Palestine. We believe the refusal to broadcast the documentary Gaza, Medics Under Fire is just one in a long line of agenda-driven decisions. It demonstrates once again that the BBC is not reporting without fear or favour when it comes to Israel. Now, it goes on to note that the decision not to broadcast that investigation was taken by BBC management, despite the content being signed off in accordance with BBC guidelines and editorial policy, which it says appears to be a political decision, adding that the BBC response shows the organisation is crippled by the fear of being perceived as critical of the Israeli government. I mean, the decision not to broadcast this is a scandal. The BBC only broadcast one other documentary which actually looked properly at the war crimes being committed every single day against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And then they pulled that documentary because the child narrator was the son of a deputy agricultural minister who's a technocrat, which had no bearing on anything he said because it was a child narrator whose words were scripted for him rather than, say, his father. And they capitulated the BBC to the demands of the pro-Israel lobby. Here's another documentary which passes all their checks, which passed the Channel 4 taking it on. They've gone through their rigorous process. And the BBC refused to show a programme which documents the objective systematic attacks on the healthcare system, the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza. For what reason? What reason? The letter emphasises that the signatories are not asking the BBC to pick a side, but just to allow BBC journalists to do their jobs in delivering facts transparently with due context. They note one striking failure. As an organisation, we have not offered any significant analysis of the UK government's involvement in the war on Palestinians. We've failed to report on weapons sales or their legal implications. These stories have instead been broken by the BBC's competitors. This is, by the way, one of many striking scandalous failures on the part of the BBC, which is a public service broadcast in Britain, which is duty-bound to hold the British government to account. It has failed to do so in the most grotesque way possible, frankly. And this is a really crucial allegation, or a really crucial allegation. The letter says, this hasn't happened by accident, rather by design. Much of the BBC's coverage in this area is defined by anti-Palestinian racism. That's exactly it, and it is BBC journalists saying this. There hasn't even been a pretense by the BBC that Palestinian life has even the fraction of the worth of an Israeli life or those deemed Westerners. When I did my detailed investigation into BBC coverage on Israel and Palestine for Dropsite News at the end of last year, I worked with data journalists who showed, having done rigorous analysis through objective and incontrovertible statistics, how this is the case. Now, the letter mentions a crucial name. It says the inconsistent manner in which guidance is applied draws into focus the role of Sir Robbie Gibb on the BBC board and BBC's Editorial Standards Committee. We are concerned that an individual with close ties to the Jewish Chronicle, an outlet that has repeatedly published anti-Palestinian, often racist content, has a say in the BBC editorial decisions in any capacity, including the decision not to broadcast Gaza Medics Under Fire. So Robbie Gibb is a striking, disturbing case study. The brother of a Tory minister, he joined the BBC as a political researcher after he graduated from university, before becoming chief of staff for the Conservative Shadow Chancellor Francis Maude. He then returned to the BBC as deputy editor of the flagship current affairs programme Newsnight, then became the editor for BBC Live programming, for example, Daily Politics, you may remember, where he worked closely with its main presenter, who of course was Andrew Neil, the chairman of the Hard Right Spectator magazine. He then went off in 2017 to become Director of Communications for the Tory Prime Minister Theresa May. He then returned to the BBC. Are you getting dizzy by this revolving door, by the way? Just between the BBC and the Tories. He joined its board. He was later singled out by the likes of the former Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis, who described him as an active agent of the Conservative Party. He was shaping the corporation's news output by acting as the arbiter of BBC impartiality. In 2020, he led a consortium bid to buy the Jewish Chronicle, a newspaper which, rather than doing what is vitally important, offering media representation for Britain's Jewish community, has acted instead as a zealous cheerleader of the Israeli state. And indeed, that newspaper has published, as the letter notes, hideously anti-Palestinian racist output. It's absolutely remarkable that this man has the power and influence he does at the BBC. Can you imagine, just imagine, someone with left-wing and pro-Palestinian connections having this power and influence? There is more chance of the moon turning into a giant panda called Flibble than that ever happening. As the letter notes, this conflict of interest highlights a double standard for BBC content makers who have themselves experienced censorship in the name of impartiality. In some instances, staff have been accused of having an agenda because they have posted news articles critical of the Israeli government on their social media. By comparison, Gibb remains in an influential post with little transparency regarding his decisions, despite his ideological leanings being well known. We can no longer ask licence fee payers to overlook Gibb's ideological allegiances. The letter notes that the BBC's reporting on Israel and Palestine fall short of our own editorial standards, with a gulf between the BBC's coverage of what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank and what our audience can see is happening via multiple credible sources, including human rights organisations, staff at the UN, and journalists on the ground. Which is why the letter makes an incendiary claim. All too often, it is felt that the BBC has been performing PR for the Israeli government and military. Note that over 100 journalists who spend their lives working for the BBC have stated their agreement with this. They state, we have been forced to conclude that decisions are made to fit a political agenda rather than serve the needs of an audience. They go on to note their extreme concern about BBC reporting on the issue falling short of the standards our audiences expect, adding that we believe the role of Robbie Gibb, both on the board and as part of the Editorial Standards Committee, is untenable. We call on the BBC to do better for our audiences and recommit to our values of impartiality, honesty and reporting without fear of favour. Other than those BBC journalists, there are signatories like the actors Juliet Stevenson, Khaled Abdallah, Zari Ashton, Miriam Margolyes. Now, BBC insiders have some choice things to say. One of them says, at the BBC, the strength of feeling against Gibb is palpable. In corridors at New Broadcasting House, staff confide in each other about the illogical decisions reached by management and the role that Gibb has to play. We often feel we are in an abusive relationship with the BBC in which we are gaslit and pacified. They go on to say we're exhausted by the double standards and the suspension of editorial standards. For many staff, this has shattered any notion of fairness. We feel we're going to console each other about how this has been allowed to happen. We believe the BBC will not be able to deliver on its commitment to fairness and due impartiality while Gibb is in post. Another note, for more than a year now, we've been aware that the BBC's news output is out of step with reality. Audiences are being asked not to believe their own eyes and ears. Anyone with a phone has seen the footage coming out of Gaza and the West Bank, yet BBC News has tied itself in knots with notions of complexity. Why have we taken a clear position on Ukraine and Russia when we fail to confidently assert facts when it comes to the Palestinian people? Robbie Gibb is at least part of the answer. We raise these concerns so many times and we have not been listened to. We are speaking out because we must serve audiences better. Well, damning stuff really, isn't it, from BBC journalists? Indeed, this is just another example of the biggest scandal of Western journalism of our time. What the BBC and other news organisations did is either completely erase the statements of genocide and criminal intent made by Israeli leaders and officials, or bury them, and indeed refuse to explain the genocide and criminal nature of these statements. These statements prove the most accurate roadmap predictor of what Israel would go on to do, and yet the BBC completely misled the audiences about Israel's intent, treating these statements as though they were somehow being issued in a parallel universe, instead zoning in on deceitful statements issued by Israeli officials designed to mislead Western audiences. The BBC repeatedly framed their stories around the false statements and claims of the Israeli state, treating them as credible, despite the overwhelming evidence of Israel lying over and over again, and indeed, as they are very obviously committing in a very unbelievably documented and unprecedented level of documentation, every single war crime or crime against humanity under the sun. Palestinian voices receive much, much less coverage and were prosecuted as though they were in the dock in a way pro-Israel voices are not on broadcast television. Atrocities and war crimes ignored, whitewashed. Studies exposing war crimes ignored or given precious little coverage. Palestinian life treated as having infinitely less worth than Israeli life, while emotive terms such as massacre were reserved for Israeli victims rather than Palestinian victims. Humanising words proportionately used far more for Israeli victims than Palestinian victims, while sentences such as Hamas-run health ministry were woven in as standard in coverage to undermine faith in the death toll in Gaza. Basic facts like the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defence minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity were not. The fact that there is a consensus amongst genocide scholars, including Israeli genocide scholars, that Israel is committing genocide has been suppressed, with those scholars being ignored. We could go on. Honestly, there's an endless list. I mean, this really is the biggest scandal in Western journalism of our age. And the BBC is not alone in this, but the BBC is paid by us, the licence fee payers. It's a public service broadcasting organisation. And, you know, I speak to BBC journalists and they really are not asking to take sides. It's not like, oh, these are activists who just want the BBC to bend to activist demands. They just want the BBC to actually apply what it says it is supposed to do to this topic where it has suspended the journalistic norms it claims to have. It's not a big ask, is it? But what the BBC have done in practice is play a pivotal role in one of the great crimes of our age, genocide. You can never scrub the shame away there. But it is up to us to keep up the pressure. And, you know, what's so important about this letter, as well as putting pressure on BBC management, it again shows no one can say they didn't know at the time. No one can say they didn't know. This was all done in broad daylight and people knew exactly what was happening. There's no room to plead ignorance. Everyone knew. And our media organisations have played a pivotal role. This letter is really incendiary. It is utterly damning of what the BBC have done. And they don't have an actual response to this, do they? Not a proper, accurate response. Because it's indefensible what they've done. And in the court of history, they won't be able to defend themselves. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts and your comments. Help us take on this pro-genocide media, a media which has been complicit and facilitated genocide at patreon.com/OwenJones84. You make all of this possible. As you can see, across YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, all the rest. That's all down to you. We're reaching millions of people. Millions of people, thanks to you. So do help support us. Share the video, press like and subscribe, leave your comments. Listen to our podcast if you prefer. Speak to you soon.